So Fort Kids, you are dismissed, and y'all have a great time down there in Fort Kids. Adults, we're back in the book of Acts. Turn in your Bibles to Acts chapter 27, verse 1. We are almost done with the book of Acts. So Acts chapter 27, verse number 1. And as you're turning there, I'd like to ask you give me some grace today. I've got a really bad migraine that started yesterday, so I'm going to try to stay focused here and go take a nap once church is over. So please be in prayer for me as we go. Well, if you saw the pictures on Wednesday night of our fall festival, you spent some time on social media. If you've been on social media at all, you've seen videos of people doing silly, ridiculous things as also reckless things. You've also seen videos of people just kind of caught in moments that they can't help. And one of my things that I just go to, I don't know why I gravitate towards this, but there's an inlet down in Miami that is known for having large waves and being very difficult to travel. And I just like to watch the videos of people in boats navigating these waves. There's people on stand-up paddle boards, there's people on jet skis, people on big boats, little boats, and it's just interesting to see what happens. Now, unfortunately, there are moments where there's some emergencies and people don't handle the seas very well, and in those comments, in fact, on those videos that you've seen where people are videoing something reckless or danger, you'll always see somebody make this comment: put the phone down and go help, right? Like, instead of videoing it, instead of having your phone out and videoing, why not use your phone to call 911? We've all seen those comments. And in fact, if you've been in a school, if something bad happens in a school, all the kids, boom, video it, right? Got to get the phone out, got to record it. Why do we do that? Psychologists have actually determined something called a bystander effect, where naturally we look at a situation and we think about the situation and go, either that's beyond what I can do and to intervene, that's something that is just so crazy it'll never happen again, I've got to record it, or we want to document, or we just want to be able to share the moment with other people. It's a bystander effect. Instead of intervening and helping, we actually take the role of standing back and just watching. Why do I bring that up to you? Jesus said in Matthew 9:36-37, that when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Why are the laborers few? We've got tons of churches and tons of people. It's because naturally we as people are bystanders, that we stand by and watch whatever's happening out in the world, because we either think about things like this: man, I don't know enough to get involved. That situation is beyond what I can do. That's too painful for me to get involved. Or we may see a moment of sacrifice, or we may even reason it away and say, well, that's somebody else's job. In Acts chapter 27, Paul is in a situation to where he's been trying to get to Jerusalem. He went to Jerusalem earlier in the book of Acts. He was arrested, he's been on trial, and he's being sent to Rome. We've been out of the book of Acts for about a month now, just to kind of remember where we were. And on his travel to Rome, he's going to get onto a ship and be out of his element. He's not a sailor. And he has a choice of, is he going to be a bystander and just kind of go along with the flow, or is he going to be what I would call a first responder, which we are called to be as Christians, and actually speak into it the things that God has told him, to intervene and bring the grace and the gospel into a situation. In Paul's heart, the reason he did everything in life was he looked out at the world and he didn't just see brokenness. He saw brokenness that Jesus wanted to heal. And sometimes it's easy for us as Christians just to talk about the brokenness and to forget about the fact that God wants us to be his ambassadors, his first responders, his plan A, to go into the world and to invade it with hope, to invade it with love, to invade it with the peace and the presence of God. And that's exactly what Paul does here, starting in Acts chapter 27 in verse 1. Let's read together. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Now, just pause there for a second. Imagine with me for a second that you are Paul. Scholars believe that he gave his life to Christ at roughly the age of 28 to 30 in either 34 or 35 AD. Why is that important? Because in Acts chapter 27, he's roughly 60 years old. So he's been a Christian for roughly 25 to 26 years of his life. And at this point in his life, if he was living in America, he'd be thinking about retirement. He's roughly 60, that instead of thinking about getting on a ship and going to Rome, he's probably thinking about how can I take a Mediterranean cruise in my retirement, right? He's trying to think about how can I stop having to make all these tents and how can I live a comfortable life in my old age? Not just that, but he's probably heard people who he used to be friends with say, Paul, just stop talking about all that Jesus stuff. Don't you see all the problems that's brought to your life? Don't you see how you've been jailed? Don't you see how you've been beaten? Paul, don't you see how you were stoned and you died and you came back to life? Paul, don't you see how you used to have it great as a Pharisee? Paul, just go back to the way that things used to be. But Paul looks at the world and he's like, no, I can't do that. I see that people need hope. So he's been put onto a journey where he's going to Rome and he's appealed to Caesar and he wants to preach the gospel to Caesar. Because if the world is going to know the gospel, the best way to do that is to go through Rome. Now, if you continue reading through Acts 27, one of the things that you'll notice is that Luke uses a lot of the first person plural pronouns. He uses we and us. Why is that important? Because Luke is with Paul. That Luke is a doctor. He comes to know Christ later on in life. And as he's going and journeying with Paul, he's learning the things about Christianity firsthand from Paul. So as he's traveling, we see some connections between what Luke says about Jesus in his gospel and what Paul is doing. That Jesus was on a journey to Jerusalem where he eventually died. And Paul also was on a journey to Jerusalem that would eventually take him to Rome for him to die for his faith. What would possess somebody like Paul in their 60s to do something like that? Why risk your life for others? Look at verse 9. Since much time has passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, to spend the winter there. For us here in North Georgia, good old Appalachia, we don't get the sense and the significance of this passage telling us these things about the harbors and how they faced. We're not seafaring people. But the importance of this is there's a quote from Richard Longenecker. He's a passed away biblical scholar. He says, navigation in this part of the Mediterranean was always dangerous after the 14th of September and was considered impossible after the 11th of November. So roughly the same time of year that we are in, when Paul is sailing across the Mediterranean, it is almost impossible to pass. Why? Because there's massive storms that come at this time of the year, that nobody wants to be on the water in winter. If you've watched what's that show up in Alaska with the tuna, Dangerous Catch? If you've watched that show, you've seen massive waves, massive storms in the freezing cold of the north. Some of those storms will impact the Mediterranean and can sink ships super, super easily. In fact, Paul, as we're going to see later in the passage, is on a ship with roughly 270 people, and he's trying to give warnings to them because he's like, guys, you're going to perish. This is not a good decision. Guys, I'm a leather maker, and I can even tell that it's probably not good to be a sailor right now. Guys, I can see these things are not going the way that you wish for them to go. In fact, we get the note here that it's about the fast being over in reference to the Day of Atonement. We would call it Yom Kippur. And the fast was normally, it goes along with the Day of Atonement in late September, early October. So these guys are coming out of a fast, and they're going to travel, and it's a very dangerous time to be on the seas. But they started sailing again. And in fact, in verse 13, the winds even seemed favorable for a time. But things quickly changed when a storm called a nor'easter came out of the northeast and hit the Mediterranean Sea and pushed them, and they were literally, as Jesus would say in Matthew 9:36 through 37, using these type of sailing terms, harassed and helpless in the original language. That's exactly how they were. They were harassed and helpless. Harassed would be of a word of someone who is like getting bullied, that they can't do anything. That the word helpless there was actually a sailor's term used for a ship without a rudder. So think about what is happening here. They're literally being pushed around by the wind. They have no control of anything they are doing. And Paul is looking at a situation and he's going, this isn't going well. I mean, Paul's already heading to death, but he's looking at the ship going, man, this is not going to end well for us, guys. That I can't even get to preach the gospel in Rome if the ship sinks. So Paul had a choice here to either be a bystander and just go along with it, or would he speak up and be a first responder and tell the people what God told him to say? In fact, let me ask you, if you were in that ship, what would you have done? Would you have said, hey guys, let's try to get some influence here for Christianity and speak into the things that God has told you? Or would you say, oh, I'm a lonely prisoner, I don't want to intervene and risk my life? Now for Paul, in intervening and trying to speak up, he could have lost his life for punishment for speaking up as a prisoner. But instead, he chose to speak up and try to lead these people to safety because he knew that God loved them and he wanted to share the gospel with them. In fact, jump down to verse number 18. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Look at that last part of verse 20. All hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Have you ever had a moment in life when everything went wrong and you had no hope of moving forward? What did you do? Maybe you started abandoning things in your life. You started kicking things out, going, I gotta remove this, I gotta remove this, I gotta get into church, I gotta remove a person, remove a habit, remove an addiction, remove a pet sin, remove anything that's going on right now because I gotta free up my life so I can get through this storm. That's exactly what these people are doing here in the passage. In fact, if you remember the story of Jonah, it sounds a lot like the story of Jonah. If you remember Jonah, he was supposed to go to Nineveh, but he went the opposite way in disobedience to God and went to Tarshish. And when he was going to Tarshish, he was on a boat, and the guys on the boat didn't know that he was in disobedience to God, and God sent a storm onto the sea. And that storm caused such a ruckus on the ship, they started throwing things overboard to lighten the ship so that it didn't sink. And that's exactly what we see happening here in the story of Paul, is that they're throwing tackle overboard. They're trying to lighten the ship. They're tearing the cargo apart and throwing it overseas. And could you imagine Paul sitting in the ship, seeing all that's happening, him being a scholar of the Old Testament and going, God, have I been disobedient like Jonah was? Because here's what our brains do sometimes. We go into bad situations and we begin thinking negative and we begin thinking, oh, God's out for me, that I've blown it, that I've messed up, that God's punishing me for things that I've done. And we start to build connections to biblical stories and go, that's exactly what's happening for me right now. So we feel like God is out to get us. But here's what I believe was going on for Paul. I think Paul was holding on to a verse that he wrote to the Romans in Romans 8, verse 1. Paul said, there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Why is that so important? Because there's a difference between condemnation and discipline. In fact, God may discipline you, but he's not mad at you. God may discipline you, but he's not mad at you. He disciplines because he loves you as a father loves a child. In fact, listen to Hebrews 12, verse 7. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom your father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and are not sons. Listen, here's some great news for us this morning. If you are disciplined, thank God for it, because that means that you are his. However, if you can sin and get away with it without discipline, what a fearful place that is, because that means you are not his child. Some scholars look at this passage and they're split. There's some that say because of the warnings that Paul had heard earlier in the book of Acts about not going to Jerusalem because of the pain that he would endure, that this moment is in fact a moment of just like Jonah where he's being disciplined. And there's other people who are saying he was just learning about and just getting a taste of what it was going to be like when he got to Jerusalem. And in fact, him hearing that further cemented his decision to go to Jerusalem because he knew what he would endure. That I'm kind of on more of this side with the other scholars of saying I believe that Paul knew what he was going through. In fact, he was dedicated so much to God that he was willing to sacrifice. I fall over on this side. So here's why I tell you that. Just because you go through a storm like Paul did doesn't mean that God is even using that as a moment of discipline. But sometimes for us as Christians, we just go through crazy moments of life because life is crazy. There's not an evil spirit out behind every corner trying to attack us. That sometimes things just happen because we're in a broken world. On the same token, just because something happens to us and we're being broken apart in life doesn't mean that God is disciplining us. Sometimes it's just life is broken. So what do we do in that? We choose to live for God. We choose to love God and follow his purpose for us. In fact, in this moment, Paul could have gone down into the belly of a ship and just cried and said, God, woe is me. God, this is not going the way that I want it to go. He could have written some letters and said, guys, I'm turning away from all of this. I'm taking a break. This is too much. I'm too broken. But instead, Paul decided to be a first responder and in the middle of the storm to say some things to help out. He chose not to be a bystander. He chose to engage instead of disengage when things got crazy in life. In fact, look at verse 21. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Verse 22, now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. Did you see it? Think about Paul's instructions that he gave to the people versus the people's reactions in verse 20. In verse 20, it ends and says, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. But there's Paul. And Paul stood up when all hope was gone, and Paul spoke gently to these people and said, guys, here's what God has told me. Trust in what God has told me. Paul stood on what God had told him. Paul decided to listen to what God had told him and the hope that he had that he would get to be a part of gospel advance in Rome, that he would get to walk off of the ship onto dry ground, that he would get to survive, brought him to a place to where he couldn't just be a bystander and let hopeless people walk around and live life. He had to intervene. He had to share something. He had to speak up, that the hope that he had from God, the trust that he had in God, the trust that he had built from worship, the trust that he had from serving God for years after years after years, decades after decades, brought him to a place to where even in the middle of a storm-tossed sea, he was still willing to stand up and speak the truth. And with all the freedoms that we have here in America, with all the abilities that we have to get together as Christians and worship, why do we not speak up? Why do we not take those blessings and use them? Sometimes comfort breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds apathy. I'm kind of hesitant to share this with you because I know some of you are going to be like, whoa, Pastor, I can't believe you did that. On Friday, I went with two friends, and we visited a mosque in Chattanooga. And we sat in the back of the service. They had some metal chairs there for us as observers, and we sat in the back and watched the service. Why did I do that? I did not do it because I'm interested in learning about Islam just to learn about it. I sat there because here's what you have to realize, and I have to realize as Christians. There's a large amount of Muslims who are moving into our area, and if we don't know about their faith, we can't reach them. So I went to experience it. I went to take it in and learn what they do so that I can share the gospel with them. I went to build some relationships because in knowing people, we can connect our hearts and connect as friends, and then I can share the gospel with them. And in sitting there in the back, you know what I got really convicted about? There were people who were there at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon that left their job and came to a mosque to worship a false god. That I sat there, and if we didn't have chairs in the room, would be like, we can't do church today. The floor is too hard. Every person sat on the floor. They listened to a sermon about gossip, that they were talking about how that hurts the heart of Allah. And I sat there and I thought, man, but how many times do we as Christians share gossip as prayer requests? And that we rationalize it away. And I sat there and I thought, man, these men are raising their children in this, that they're connected, they're there, they're doing, as they would say, their obligation, that they had something that happened to a local mosque. And when they were talking about what happened to that local mosque, the person who was speaking on Friday said, hey guys, there's a meeting at Town Hall on Tuesday at 9 a.m. I know it's going to be difficult for you to be there, but show up and show support. And people were lining up to talk about being there. They're like, hey, we'll get off work. We'll do whatever it takes to be there, to be able to make a difference. And I sat there and I just got really, really convicted because I thought, how much do we, as people who actually have the truth of the gospel, the truth of the Bible, the true God, rationalize away, disengaging when these people who are worshiping something false engage more than we do in politics, engage more than we do in our community, engage more in their local body of believers. Like, man, we're Baptist, it rains, and we can't come to church. Right? Like, let's just be real. I'm preaching to the choir this morning. Daylight savings time happened, and we got an extra hour of sleep. You know what I'm going to hear this week when I call people like, hey, I missed you. Well, you know, the time changed. Like, bro, you got an extra hour of sleep. You know, like I'll check in with people sometimes like, man, I got in at like 1 o'clock this morning and it was really tired. Church is at 11. If you slept 8 hours, you woke up at 9 and had an hour and a half to get ready to make a 30-minute drive. You know, like all of our reasons that we use for not engaging with God and not engaging in local church, if we said those to the Muslims, you know what they would say? Your faith is worthless. And man, I just got convicted. Sitting there in a room watching men pray over their boys and raise their boys to worship a false god, and they did it with full conviction. But man, we'll put sports and we'll put games and we'll put everything above the things of God. Because we've made it American Christianity instead of Christian American. The adjective makes all the difference. The adjective, what comes before the noun? American Christian. I'm going to be American in how I do my Christianity instead of being Christian in how we do our Americanism. And at what point do we look out at a world that has no hope and say, as Paul did, God has told me this and I've got to share it with you? Where has our conviction gone? Where has our sense of looking out and realizing that if we believe that people really do go to heaven and hell, that means every person is bound for hell without Jesus? And what are we going to do about it? We've taken a bystander approach to just being like, well, that's the pastor's job, that's the youth minister's job, that's the worship leader's job, that's the missionary's job. No, that's our job as Christians. That the good commission to go out and reach people with the gospel was not just given to preachers and staff members and missionary workers and elders. It was given to every single Christian. Our problem is that we look at things and we're like, oh, that can wait, when it can't, because, man, people are caught and they are harassed and helpless. And they are in need of saving. And Paul's in a moment where he just looks and he says, I can't be a bystander. I've got to stand up. I've got to be a first responder. So Paul gave hope to hopeless people because he could give away what he had. You know, we can only give away hope to hopeless people when we have Jesus' hope alive in us. I love to fish, but I do not love the ocean. I love to fish, but I do not like deep bodies of water. I don't like not being able to see what's underneath my feet when I'm on a boat, right? I don't like not being able to see the bottom. I really like if you would just take the water and freeze it and put it on the side of a mountain and let me snowboard on it. That's like, I'm down for that kind of a water. That's the only kind of water that I really, truly like is snow. But I also have this irrational fear of drowning that keeps me away from doing certain things. I have a fear of it. And in fact, I think it's a biblical fear because the Jewish people thought that water was chaos. So in fact, let me prove it to you. Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The earth was without form and void. Here it is. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So right there in creation, that there's something about the water, there's something about the sea that has darkness in it, and the Spirit of God is hovering over, protecting and watching over it. Listen to Psalm 89, verse 9. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Talking about in our lives, there are moments where it's like a raging sea and God stills those waves. He is over them. In fact, if you think about the majority of the attacks upon Israel, it's been from the Philistines, which were a people who were sea-bearing people. To pick up this theme in the book of Revelation 13, verse 1, I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head. Interesting side note, if you're a Bible nerd like me, people in the American Revolution time interpreted this verse as the ships that were coming from England, because they said, oh, that ship has 7 sails, just like the 7 heads, and that they had all these different symbolisms there. So just an interesting little note. Is coming out of the sea. Listen to Revelation 21, verse 1. It says, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Here it is. And the sea was no more. Here's why I share that with you. Paul is going through a storm, and it's not in the mountains. It's not in the desert. Paul is going through a storm on the sea. And here's how Paul would have been thinking. This is Satan's attack against me. You know what Paul could have done? Paul could have taken this spiritual battle that was happening all around him, and he could have just said, man, God, this storm's too big. God, I'm done. This is overwhelming. God, I'm fearing for my life. I haven't been in a situation like this before, God. I don't know that you're going to come through. So I'm just going to leave it up to you. I'm not going to get involved. God, this is too much. And he could have gone back into the bystander effect of saying, God, this is beyond anything I can do. This is beyond anything I can experience. This is beyond anything that I can do. But instead, Paul engaged in the spiritual battle in spiritual ways. He prayed, he worshiped, he spoke up, he shared the gospel, he told revelations that God had given to him in the private times of his worship. In fact, look down in verse 31. Paul said to the centurions and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Now, here's what's interesting about that word saved. In the Greek, there's different words for saved. There's a word like you're literally saved by a lifeguard, but then there's a word for being saved like salvation in Jesus. And the word he uses here is salvation in Jesus, that Paul is not just looking at how he can get out of the storm. Listen, he's looking for how he can use the storm to get people out of hell. Let me ask you, when you go through moments in life, are you just looking to get out of the storm, or are you looking to use the storm to get people out of hell? Can I tell you something? Sometimes the only times people will listen to Christians is when they watch us go through a storm. When life's great and we get to tell people we're blessed, nobody cares. But people connect through brokenness and hardship. So Paul is in the middle of it. Luke's with him, probably some other disciples with him. And look at how they are starting to listen to Paul in verse 32. the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. They trusted in Paul's Christianity and his belief so much so that they cut away the life raft and said, Paul, if you believe in this God this much, we do too. 270 men, one Paul, but a God that's bigger than everybody. And Paul said, I'm not just going to be a bystander. I'm going to engage. I'm going to speak up. I'm going to speak out, so much so that people began to believe in him in the storm. Don't let your storm silence you. Let your storm reveal the hope that's in your heart. Speak up about Jesus. Speak up about the pain. Speak up about the things that God's told you. Walk through the storms and help people learn. You know, we don't always get to connect the dots, and we don't always get to see how the stories connect. But what's happening here for Paul is that Paul is in the middle of the storm, and he's not letting the storm shake him. He's letting God turn the storm into a moment that he can shake up the people's hearts for the gospel. The person who can walk into storms and the storms don't shake them are people who have a hope beyond the storm, that don't let the storm shake you. In fact, look down at what happens in verse 34. Therefore, I urged you to take food, for it will give you strength. For not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to the God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. That's language having to do with communion. Basically, Paul is looking at this moment as a moment to commune with God in front of all these people as a witness that he has the hope in him that can move beyond the storm that they're going through. Verse 36, then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Verse 37, we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. That they trusted in Paul so much so that they said, this is going to be our last meal. And since this is going to be our last meal, we'll give up everything. Notice they threw it into the sea. Why'd they throw it into the sea? Because they were still in a storm. The sun hadn't broken through yet. The cloud cover was still there. In fact, when you read in verse 39 through 44, they start trying to test and see how deep they are because they're scared they're going to run aground. And then eventually they do run onto a reef. And when they run onto the reef, then they look at people and the centurions and the soldiers are starting to think, hey, we're going to kill all of the prisoners in case they escape. You know what the centurion did? He said, guys, don't touch Paul. Why? Because Paul got him there. Imagine if Paul had just said, this is beyond me, guys. I'm not going to intervene. And he'd just been a bystander. 276 people would have perished on a ship. God spoke, and people would have thought that God was silent because God's man would not have said anything. Who does God want to use you to speak to? Who could you be, as someone once said, the Bible that someone reads? What if no one else in this person's life is a Christian but you, and God wants to use you to reach that person? Are we going to be a bystander, or are we going to be a first responder? Paul's response saved people by bringing them safely to shore because he decided to stand on the principles of God and have hope that God had given them. Romans 15:13 says, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit you may abound in hope. Here's a main point for you this morning. I want you to write this down. I don't think it's going to come up on the screen, but I want you to write this down. Hope-filled people should be hope-dealing people. Hope-filled people should be hope-dealing people. If we have the hope of God in our life, we should be giving the hope of God to people who don't have hope. If you look out at the world, this is a time where a lot of people don't have hope. People don't trust the government. People don't trust their job. People don't trust the economy. People don't trust businesses. But people need something to trust in. They need someone to trust in, and that is the Lord. So are we going to be people who will watch others suffer in their sin, or will we be the first responders? I heard a story this week from Josh Howerton. He's a pastor in Lake Point, Texas, and he shared a story that he had read about by Gus Lee in a leadership book, and the story was about a Major Norman, I'm going to butcher this name, Schwarzkopf. Major Schwarzkopf went to West Point, and he was lecturing to a group of young soldiers, and he put the situation in front of them. He said, guys, let's say that you are in Vietnam, and there's a young group of Vietnamese soldiers from the north, and they're attacking you in the south, and they attack every single day. But you've had orders to stay in the south, and if you cross the border, then you are violating those orders. But they come every day, and they attack you every single day. And he said when they attack, they kill the people that you love. They kill the people in the village. They kill the people who you've been in the military with. They attack relentlessly, and you can only pursue them to the border. Now, as you pursue them to the border, they stand on the other side of the border, and they mock you, and they tease you, and they make fun of you, and there's nothing that you can do about it. But you found out of where they're going to raid tonight, and you know where they're going to raid, and you know where they're coming. And he said, here's the question I ask you. Are you going to finally pursue them across the border, or are you going to play it safe and just stay on your side of the border? Which will you do? Will you stay and go and attack, or will you go and attack, or will you stay and continue to endure? So he asked the class, he said, class, any questions? The young man raised his hand. He said, are we allowed to go across the border and to completely wipe out the enemy? And the major said, yes, you are. The young man said, okay. Another young man raised his hand. He said, if we cross the border and attack the enemy, are we going to start another war? And the major said, no, there'll be no more war. These are rogue militia type people that are attacking you. And the young man said, okay. Another young man asked, he raised his hand and he said, if we cross the border and wipe them out completely, are we going to be in trouble? And the major said, oh, total trouble. It's going to cost you everything. You're going to be demoted. You're going to lose everything. You may even face prison time. You may be fined. There's going to be some really big repercussions if you go across the border and attack. So he paused. He said, all right, class, what will you do? He asked the class, he said, raise your hand if you would stay. And hands all across the room went up. And he said, okay. Put their hand back down. And he looked back out at the class, and he asked who would go, and just a sparse few hands raised their hand. And Gus Lee said in his book about leadership, he said, the major looked at the class and smiled and said, the correct answer is to go. And he said, here's why the correct answer is to go. It will cost you your life. It will cost you your job, and you will disobey orders. But leadership is not built on playing it safe. Making an impact is not built on being a lifelong careerist of just following the rules. It is built on character. And how could we allow an enemy to continue attacking our people and never do anything about it? And here's the point Josh Howerton made about it. He asked the church, as I ask you today, will we be bystanders or will we be courageous first responders who say, enough is enough, Satan? Enough is enough. You've crossed a border way too many times. You've attacked my family. You've attacked my job. You've attacked my community. You've attacked my friends. And enough is enough. That we be first responders. How do we do that and still have hope? Here's how we do it. The first thing is this. We halt playing the victim card. We halt playing the victim card. Paul was in a storm with 270 other people, and they were all in the same storm together. Paul could have just sat there and God, I'm a man after your own heart. Why am I going through this? But instead, he decided not to be self-centered, and he looked out at the world and said, I'm going to bring the hope to these people. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to live out of the victory of Jesus and do something about it. I'm not just going to complain about the things that are going on. I'm going to bring a resolution to it. Letter O, he ordered his heart to worship. Storms have a way of pushing us either to worship or away from worshiping, but we don't worship because of the storm. We don't worship our way out of a storm. Listen, there is no place in the Bible that tells you to worship as a way of spiritual warfare. Worship is a vital part of our spiritual life. However, we battle with the sword, which is the Bible, and the Bible speaks onto things. And as we worship, we submit ourselves to God, but we do not just defeat Satan just by worshiping. We use the word of God. We speak, we love, we share these things with the world. The letter P, we preach God's purpose to ourselves. that Paul had to remind himself and others what God's purpose was, that he was going to see Caesar. In fact, if you read the story over, he tells people, hey, I'm not dying in this. I'm going to see Caesar. And you have to remind yourself that you as a Christian are preaching the gospel to people. This is not just going to be the end of your life. And if it is the end of your life, then let it be the end of your life by you praising Jesus and speaking peace to our world. The final thing, expect God to be faithful when you're a first responder, even without the full plan. That when Paul last spoke to these guys and told them that nobody was going to die, he didn't have the full plan. He didn't know. He didn't know they were going to run aground on a reef. He may have thought they were going to run into a beach. But Paul, without having the full plan, he still chose to speak up and respond. And sometimes we as Christians are like, God, I can't go in because I don't know how this is all going to work out. I don't know the full plan. Listen, it's called faith for a reason. That we trust in God and we respond out of just saying, God, I'm going to trust you with the plan because I don't understand where it's going, but I'm going to trust you in this moment. And that is hope. Hope-filled people should be hope-dealing people. With every head